Afternoon, LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us. Tasha here with the Yeeboo Digital team. And we're going to be having a great conversation today, talking about the art of evergreen content in your marketing and fundraising efforts. Super excited to talk about evergreen because I know we all get into that end of year panic. Giving Tuesday, everything seems to happen in this huge clump at the end of the year. So oftentimes we're a full suite marketing and fundraising agency here in Canada, and we end up having some pretty interesting conversations with a lot of panicked nonprofits at the end of the year. So a lot of reliance on all of that money coming in at the same time. So we thought, let's talk about what it looks like to build a strategy that will hopefully bring in funds throughout the year. So super excited for everyone joining us today. As I said, Yeeboo Digital, and we empower nonprofits to lead with digital. And I'm going to let my wonderful CEO introduce himself quick.
Awesome. Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Great. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. So Eric Rubito, founder and CEO here at Yeeboo Digital. Just about a 20-year digital fundraiser, and yeah, excited to be talking about this this concept today. With me, I've got Trevor Rickman as well. So Trevor, I'll let you introduce yourself from here.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. I'm the lead digital strategist here at Yeeboo. So I am primarily responsible for our digital marketing and fundraising strategy clients, getting them into market, creating all of the wonderful content that we create along with our design team, and as we'll talk about today, executing these evergreen campaigns.
Perfect. So we're live. You have two experts in the field available to ask questions. So happy for people to throw comments into the chat. And at any time, we're going to just kind of pull things in. So if you have questions as Trevor and Eric start talking about Evergreen, please feel free to drop them in and we'll handle them in real time. So we're going to start out. I've immediately kind of thrown in some lingo by saying evergreen, although we can kind of picture the tree, right? And like what that looks like and kind of how that might tie in, especially as Canadians. Evergreen is something that we maybe know more intimately. But why don't you start, Eric? What is evergreen marketing and fundraising, and what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the easiest way to think of it. It is something that you create and you continue to keep in market. We have a tendency, I think, in our sector to think from a campaign perspective, to kind of go initiative to initiative to initiative. And although maybe the discrepancy between these two, the distinguishing point between these two isn't that, you're still in market, you're still doing those things. The difference is that in that campaign to campaign mode, you're never growing anything on the momentum. You're not, the work that you've done is not going to help you in the next iteration or the next campaign. So it's really kind of leaning into the idea of, permanent presence in market, but also on the idea of kind of compounding returns, right? The more you are in market, the more you are basically being exposed to your potential donors, and the more likely that the frequency and the, what's what I'm looking for here is, like the exposure and the frequency are going to come together to kind of actually bring people to you more regularly, more frequently.
Yeah. Awesome. What would you add to that, Trevor?
I mean, I think one of the things that Eric and I have been talking about recently is like what evergreen is not, because I think it's an important distinction, right? And it's something that I think our sector for a long time has probably mistakenly identified. Things like paid search, from our perspective, are not evergreen because they're reactive, right? You're only showing yourself to people who are actively looking for you, or in theory, things sort of closely related to your mission and cause. So from our perspective, evergreen is always proactive. It's actively reaching out to show either your donors, potential donors, what you're doing, who you are, and what your brand is. So I think it's an important thing to start talking about internally. If you as organizations are talking about your evergreen strategy, but really evergreen really only entails your Google grant and possibly some Google search, it's likely that you're not running what we at least would consider to be a traditional evergreen content strategy or strategy.
So when we think evergreen, and I mean just from a marketer's perspective, I think Evergreen can't simply be just your email content, and it can't just be your ad content. We're not talking about Evergreen on one channel. I think Evergreen does have to exist across probably more channels, because we know one channel is not going to be enough, right? I know, Trevor, you and I have talked a lot about omni-channel in marketing. So is Evergreen kind of that thing, that type or style of marketing fundraising that has to exist across multiple platforms as well? When we're talking about building Evergreen, does it need to be in multiple channels, or is there one that might be better?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't need to. Our recommendation would be that it is. I think the space, digital advertising, digital marketing, has evolved so much in the last 5 years that like what used to be considered a strong evergreen approach really just involves something like Instagram and Facebook and potentially some display, right? And those sort of were the core foundational channels that people would use to kind of facilitate these evergreen programs. There's the access that we now have to a whole bunch of other places, whether it be new channels like TikTok or Pinterest or places like connected television, digital out of home. Like there's just a lot more places that you can be. And Eric mentioned frequency. Certainly, from our perspective, it's not just about the number of times somebody sees your ad and say Instagram. It's about the number of times they see your ad kind of across their day.
Yeah.
And subjectively, from your own experience, that you only spend, some of us more than others, some time on certain platforms. Of course, I only do it because it's my job.
Yeah.
But the more time that you can find people in those off periods, times where they're not necessarily on a single platform, the more likely you are to drive an eventual conversion. So, I mean, certainly a recommended approach for us is omni-channel, and now more than ever, there's an opportunity to be in a bunch of very cool places that we've seen a lot of success in.
So I'm going to throw this into, just throw it out to people. I see a couple of people commenting on where they're from, which is really exciting. Thanks, guys. Also, just the question I guess I'm going to throw out is anybody doing Evergreen who's watching today? Is Evergreen part of your strategy right now? Because just would be super curious to know who is already getting started or what that looks like for your organization. And, I think when I look at Evergreen, and probably there's a little bit of what it's not. I think when you said that, Trevor, I was like, oh, maybe that's actually the easier way to define Evergreen. Do you see Evergreen as being somewhat separate from big events, from, your gala, from your Giving Tuesday campaign, from your year-end campaign? Like, can Evergreen kind of be defined also by being somewhat different than the rest of your marketing and fundraising practices?
Yeah, I think it's something, and Eric, feel free to jump in here. I think it's something that is really client by client. Like our preferred approach, because you circumvent a lot of the new learnings required in a new, say, end of year campaign, is that you actually load things like your end of year, things like your Giving Tuesday or event campaigns into a pre-existing evergreen campaign, right? So essentially what you're doing is you're changing the creative. You're changing the messaging for the same audiences. And so they get a through line of what's happening to your organization throughout the year, right?
Yeah.
And, I guess the nearest reference point would be how some commercial products market to the same audiences to you, right? What you're getting around Black Friday from that same organization, Best Buy, Casper mattresses, ND mattresses, if you're in Canada, looks very different than what you're getting at the holidays. But it's the same ask. The creative looks a little bit different. The copy is a little bit different, but ultimately they're looking for the same thing. And it depends sort of how deep down the conversion funnel you are. Maybe it's just simply a website visit. It may be an actual purchase, but ultimately it all feels and looks like it's part of the same campaign. So I don't necessarily think you need to think about them as separate, but you should be thinking about individual content strategies depending on the time of year. Right. I mean, that's sort of certainly how we've been thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's, when you sort of said the Casper mattress idea, like if you think about that, you think about the way that those for-profit brands are marketing to us. They're really what they're ebbing and flowing over the course of the year is things like urgency, things like opportunity. And then and so that's if you're kind of at surface level, right? If you're just sort of website visitor, have looked at something, haven't really engaged with, they're going to have an evergreen strategy that's going to, when they get to something like a Giving Tuesday, or in this case, a Black Friday, they're gonna try to get you to take the next step with that urgency, with that offer. In the nonprofit sector, we have similar things, right? Like if you've got someone who's kind of just at the exposure level, is in your sort of remarketing audience because they once visited your website but haven't taken any action, they're aware of your brand, and you're using Evergreen to ensure that they don't forget about you, if for nothing else. But ideally, you're actually trying to use Evergreen to get them to take the next step. And so when you're thinking about that kind of, Evergreen over the course of the year, what you're actually thinking about is opportunities, right? Opportunities, whether that's, we don't have discounts in the nonprofit sector, right? But we do have matches. We have, we have days that are very specific. We have moments in the media cycle that can be really beneficial to kind of lean into as an organization, depending on who you are. So there are definitely times and places where you're going to want to lean into those opportunities that's going to move someone down the funnel. But the other thing is thinking about what is the path that you're actually trying to get them to walk, because essentially we learned this a bunch of years ago when we were doing campaign based work with an organization, where every time they in the time between their campaigns, we were raising significantly less money than we were during the times we were in campaign mode. And so what kind of flipped for us, at that point was, well, why are we ever out of campaign mode? Why are we ever not in, why are we out of market at any given point? And it's not like the needs gone away. It's not like the opportunities got away. It's not like people stopped caring because it's not December. I think that we rely really heavily on these kind of times of year, but we could also be doing a better job with Evergreen about thinking about, actually, how are we nurturing people through the process of caring, right? Like, how are we getting them to go from being aware about something to taking an action that, brings them a little bit closer to the organization, to getting their email address, to bringing them on file, to really, like that path that you bring them down. And so that there's no particular time of year that you have to wait for that. That should be running all the time, because when you're in market, you're raising more money. And when you're out of market, you're not, because there are, I know we don't like to talk about the competitive nature in our sector, but the reality is, even though you're not, air quotes, competing with other organizations, you are absolutely competing with other organizations. You're competing with, essentially for airtime. You're competing for impressions. You're competing for mind share. Like, if there's only so much space in anyone's head at any given time, and if you're not continuing to sort of stay top of mind, you're out of the mind entirely, which means that, like, you're starting fresh, you're starting from zero when you actually re-engage with that individual at your next campaign cycle.
Yeah. I think our attention spans have never been shorter, right?
And they've never been more assaulted, right? Like, we've never, we're not wired for the level of assault that we're actually taking. So you have to think, like, frequency is one of the best things you can be doing as an organization to staying top of mind, is like actually just physically ensuring that you are staying top of mind all the time.
Yeah. And I think this leads in perfectly to, our next kind of talking point. And it's when we were planning this out, starting to talk about this series, one of the things you'd mentioned, Eric, was momentum, and the idea of momentum, right? And it's that, getting that rock rolling, and it's hard to push, right? But as soon as it stopped, are you top of mind? Do people remember, and all of that? So there's quite a deep connection, in your opinion, right? Between that evergreen brand momentum, all of that really connects together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it got me thinking about it. I don't know, I was reading some article, and there was an image in the article anyway that really just was referencing momentum, right? And the idea of, like, mass times velocity is momentum in physics, right? Like, that's just, once something's rolling, it's rolling. And it got me thinking about this idea of, like, momentum in advertising, momentum in marketing, which, it probably needs to be refined, but it's kind of like exposure times frequency equals momentum, right? Like, the more I see you and think about you, and the more I'm, like, exposed to that to your brand, the easier it is for me to remember what it was that I cared about in the first place, and the easier it is for you to kind of draw me into the next opportunity. If 3, 4, 5, 6 months go by and I haven't thought about your organization once, I'm probably not, if you load me in as an audience in, Meta or something else, like I'm a cold fish. I might remember you, I might not, it's the same with email, right? Like if you're only sending an email a quarter, like I have a hard time remembering who you are because I've received 7,000 emails a day since the last time we talked, since the last time you were in my inbox. So momentum's a really important, factor here. It's kind of why we're putting so much emphasis on this idea of evergreen, is because the second you're out of market, you're no longer in the mindshare, and it's so much harder for you as an organization to actually get back into mindshare. You have to, Trevor alluded to it earlier. It's physically harder in the systems because you have to, reload audiences and start from scratch and get the, the advertising platforms to try to figure out what you want and who the target audience is and all that. But there's also like the other side of that, which is the recipient. They've gone completely cold, and you have to start all over again in building that momentum about why they should engage with you as an organization. So, for me, the idea of perpetual is, from that brand through to those opportunities of kind of bringing people close to the organization, that momentum is so critical.
It's also why it's such a, it's easy for us to sit on the partner side and sort of say, look, this is the content approach that organizations should take. I think we're not blind to the difficulty of having to justify this type of campaign spend to senior leadership, the boards, because it's not it's not a dollar in, $1.25 out, right? And it can't be evaluated often. I shouldn't say all the time, but it often cannot be evaluated based on the performance of a single channel. So, what I mean by that is when we go into these type of content plans, when clients have agreed to sort of test something like this with us, one of the things we have to be very clear on is how we're going to evaluate success, because it's not the traditional, we're going to be in market for 3 months and raise X amount of revenue for 200 to 300% return. It's often a 12 to 16 month investment. It's a lot of time spent on the phone telling clients to be patient and that it will work, especially when you're talking about donor acquisition. I think one of the mistakes we see most often from organizations who approach us saying, look, our paid social hasn't worked in past, is because they're serving new audience with donation ads, right? It's the first contact they have with the potential donor, which is, hey, you need to give to us, or please give to us, and your gift will be matched. Well, truthfully, that potential donor doesn't really care if their gift is going to be matched. They have no idea what you're going to do or who you are.
Yeah.
So it's, we have a client that's been in market now for 6, 7 months, 8 months in a brand campaign, an evergreen brand campaign, a real just drive to a landing page, understand what this organization does, serve them with, depending on a whole bunch of actions, serve them with sort of different remarketing ads, depending on what we want them to do. But ultimately, it was a brand spend. And only in the last 3 months have they started to see some return on that investment. Those people who are coming back to the website for maybe their 3rd, 4th, 5th time are starting to donate. But what it's done is it's now created a sustainable amount of revenue month over month, an increase that is in the neighborhood of hundreds of percentile points from where they were prior to the brand investment start. But it was 6 months of like some tough weekly check-ins. And we're fortunate where they trusted us and they believed that we kind of knew what we were doing, and it is proving to be the case. But it's something that we're not blind to. It's a different investment ask, but one that I think from our perspective is well worth doing if you have that kind of time horizon.
Yeah. No, I totally. I can see. I was going to say I see it frequently in that, it's tough to make the ask to spend the money, right, and get the approval and all of those things. But I do think part of Evergreen is understanding that once things get rolling, it can be really, really powerful. But this is a potentially heavy lift at the beginning, financially and of time, or both, I guess, as well. Eric, sorry, I interrupted you. Got something to add there too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly it. It does require a bit of a shift in strategy, and it's you have to think through like how are you communicating this, how are you setting the expectation. But the reality is many organizations are doing as much effort that you would put into Evergreen over the course of the year in 4 to 6 campaign windows over the course of the year. And as I was saying earlier, from a exposure and impression standpoint, like if you change your campaign every couple of months, I'm starting over again knowing what it is we're doing. Like there's no consistency in the visual, there's no consistency in the message. The offer that is no longer there, it's a new thing. And so because of that, you're not building that momentum, you're not compounding on the work that you're doing, and you're having to start from scratch with new assets every single time. And so I think if you put it, if you stretch out what that workload looks like and what that return looks like, they're actually very similar. But one of them, you're actually going to eventually start to build a very reliable source of traffic, a very reliable source of income. As Trevor was pointing out, we're starting to see those returns with different organizations, and it's perennial. It's because as long as you're in market, there's new people joining into the program, and there's people who are kind of graduating into becoming much closer to the organization and becoming donors and supporting. And then of course you go into a completely different part, which is retention and all the stuff like stewardship and all the stuff that comes with that. But in terms of an acquisition engine, Evergreen to me just makes so much more sense, because you also don't have to one of the other things that organizations struggle with is, oh, well, we brought them in on X campaign, we didn't really connect the dots to the rest of the work that we do. And Evergreen is beautiful because you're really talking about the impact of the organization. You're talking about the brand. You're talking high level about, the things that you're doing, and you're getting an opportunity to sort of introduce them to a bunch of different things about what you're doing, and not specifically, one specific campaign or one specific piece. So I think there's a lot of value in it for a number of reasons because of that.
Yeah, I think this also, Trevor, you started to already discuss some of the reasons we've seen here at Yeeboo Digital to invest in that evergreen strategy. So one clearly is that over time, there is a lot of potential that can come out of ad spends, engagement with an evergreen strategy.
Yeah. I mean, the math is pretty simple, right? Like, especially, and a lot of what we're talking about here is like evergreen brand, right? So donor acquisition. There's a whole other strategy to be thought through on evergreen renewal. And I think there's a whole bunch of different factors. How big is your list? Because obviously as much as we've talked about frequency, there's a limit. Somebody seeing your ad 50, 70, 100. There's a limit on that kind of that frequency argument. So, but if you're talking about the evergreen brand, like the math is pretty simple, which is just like drive more people to the website and more people will eventually convert. If you create a higher volume of people who are seeing you, more people are ultimately going to become donors. Now, again, Eric talked about things you can optimize from there, right? We can talk about like your donation forms and optimizing conversion rates and conversion funnels, but at the root of it, it's a lot of what we're talking about is a volume game. So the benefit is simply getting more people to a website, to your donation forms, will result in more revenue. The other is that, and Eric sort of alluded to this as well, is that it ultimately does become a lot less effort for most of our clients and most of the organizations we work with, because you're optimizing over a longer period of time, which means hopefully you've found a lot of learnings pre kind of September, which means going into end of year, you're not searching for new audiences. You're not having to think about the channels you're going to be in. You're not having to think about budget allocation. Really the only thing you're thinking about is what is the creative we need to develop and kind of deploy it into the existing campaigns we already have.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, and I always come back to the conversation around peer-to-peer, because what a wild west peer-to-peer is, right? And someone will have donated and be like, I donated because my friend asked me to, and they're not even sure exactly what's going on. And a lot of the times those individuals are, they came in through different places. They came in from a gala, they came in from peer-to-peer, you don't always, not all of your donors came through because they're passionate about your mission and they just get what you do and they know all of the pieces. They came in on a Giving Tuesday campaign or the dreaded year-end tax receipt reason. Like, you kind of, I think Evergreen is such a cool way to talk more about your mission, to highlight the people of your mission, to highlight who you serve. And it doesn't need to be changing constantly. Like, you can change the people featured in that potential short video or whatever, but I guess that core messaging is not going to change the same way that your peer-to-peer
Yeah.
event will, or your gala next year may have a new theme. And that person's going to be like, I don't even know why I went to the gala last year, but they should know what your mission was, right? Like, the theme of the gala was probably maybe attracted them one year, but what if it doesn't the next? And so how do you kind of get those people into the fold, right? I guess, or move them
Yeah.
into more advocates or
Yeah.
people who have a passion for your mission.
Yeah, it's a good point, Tasha. I mean, we get a lot of clients who say we have this group of people and we don't know what to do with them. They won't convert, and we send them our regular emails, and it gives them a place. It gives these clients or you as an organization a place to put those groups. People who are quote unquote warm, but ultimately probably don't care about the organization, right? Like, they've donated because they knew somebody. For a lot of healthcare foundations, it's patient friend or patient family, right? Somebody was treated there. It's great. It's nice. But do they have an emotional connection with the organization beyond this individual? Probably not. So where do you put these people so that they can be taught the value of the organization effectively? And Evergreen is a really good place to do that, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chris made a really good point in the comment earlier too. That's how you put it up on screen, Tasha. But thinking about the fact that this is part of brand development. Well, we tend to be talking to a lot of fundraisers, a lot of people in that space. But of course, there's a whole different world in organizations, right? Sometimes we'll be working with organizations and they're doing a completely different brand spend. They're out in the market with X, Y, or Z, and they're doing their return metrics are totally different from what we've come to sort of expect in the fundraising space. And Evergreen is very much a combining of those things. It's very much saying, hey, let's use brand to drive, yes, brand's objectives, but also make sure that it's actually feeding fundraising objectives, feeding the beginning of something else, and using those two things strategically. Because a lot of the times, not every organization is doing brand spend, but I've definitely seen it where an organization is doing a brand spend and at the same time doing a fundraising spend, and those two things are not connected in any way, shape, or form. And it's just such a missed opportunity, both from an audience progression standpoint, but also even just from a cleanliness of what it is that I'm supposed to be understanding about you as an organization with competing messaging.
Yeah. And this is, I didn't even time this out to do it this way, but what a great intro, because the next section is questions for your team to be asking before employing Evergreen. And I think you just highlighted on something, Eric, where often there's like a siloing between what marketing is doing and fundraising is doing. We see it, in some of our work, and those departments are not well linked. And there's a plan over here with a spend for marketing that doesn't really necessarily feed fundraising, but Evergreen could be that place where they come together. So what kind of questions beyond saying maybe don't have a siloed marketing and fundraising scenario happening, but what other questions should we be asking should nonprofits be asking their team before considering employing an Evergreen campaign?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say out the gate is, and this is maybe a two-part, but it's like, do we want growth? And are we prepared for it? Because I think if you don't want growth, this isn't a strategy for you. Stay talking to the people that you're talking to and be happy. If you're looking for growth, if you're looking to expand your impact, then you are looking to, to reach new audience. And so you have to think about, well, what does that mean? And so, of course, there's the part where we're going to actually engage with new audience, right? We're going to meet new people. We're going to bring them to the website. What happens, are you ready basically for what happens from there, right? Like, do you have mechanisms by which they can engage in things? Do you have a way to capture their email? If you capture their email, what are they going to get? How connected is the through line? Do you have marketing automations in place? So you have to think through that kind of that donor journey, that experience, if you will, of what it means to be, to go from being brought in at the beginning of this this Evergreen campaign, kind of all the way through, because what you don't want to do is spend a bunch of energy up front only to find out that people are just sort of bottlenecking in your once a quarter newsletter, and they're not really getting moved any further down the down the opportunity line, if you will.
Absolutely. Anything else you kind of add in there, Trevor?
No, I will like it. I'm thinking about this silo still because it happens to us a lot. I will say it is still January. If you're in an annual giving team, a one-time gift, monthly giving team member, or you're on a communications team and you don't know what's happening on the other side of the fence, please book that meeting. Like, it is invaluable. And the number of clients that come to us and have no idea what the strategic priorities are for the coming year as it relates to communications or fundraising is remarkably high. So, being that it's the end of January, I would urge you, if you have not had that meeting internally, to have that meeting, to share your communications calendars, to make sure everybody kind of understands what your growth objectives are. Because while it's not specifically related to this, I would love to get less of those calls this year. And so I'm putting it into the ether. Have those conversations, because often we end up facilitating them, and it is remarkable what people on either side of the fence know or don't know about what's going on internally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think you make a really good point, Trevor, about the time of year. It's part of why we're talking about it now, right? Like, at this sort of end of January, people have had a chance to kind of decompress and recover from what was year end. And we're shifting into planning mode for the year ahead. And so, as you start to think about how you're going to be successful, through the end of 24, now is a great time to start thinking about how you could actually leverage this and build that momentum so that, by, as Trevor said earlier, by September, October, you've got learnings, you've got infrastructure, you've got things under your belt, and you're actually able to leverage those as you go into year end and significantly strengthen those campaigns, but also actually be in a position to ideally be raising some of that money you need to raise between here and there, right? Like, just because the return is a bit of a longer return doesn't mean that it's not worth doing today, because basically the longer you wait to see the benefit. And in the meantime, other organizations are stepping in front and are speaking to your potential donors and guiding them in different directions. So I think there's a real opportunity at this time of year to start shifting that strategy a little bit and looking how you can start to make that a bit of your reality for the year ahead.
I have a great follow-up sheet for everyone that I'm going to send around, but we just put together some of the questions you should be asking. And obviously there's a whole set of questions with donor communications, what your technology stack can even handle, which is a question. Oftentimes it's all fine and dandy to go, let's do Evergreen. And then if your technology stack can't even do that, or you don't have impact reports and measurements available to you that can really track and see that in play, I think that can be really problematic. So I'm going to send that around afterwards to everybody. Chris has a great comment here about nonprofits often don't utilize landing pages correctly to track that engagement and leads. Great point, Chris. I was going to say this. I mean, I know our team has seen that frequently as well. So great talking point, but I think asking these questions in advance, and right now such a great time of year, like Eric noted, to just begin these conversations and start making those strategic Evergreen campaign plans. So we're just going to kind of end it off here. If people have questions, feel free to start throwing them in the chat and I'll pull them up as well. But what would be your recommended steps to get started? Like, what are those kind of like maybe low, you've had some of these conversations. What are some of those like low hanging fruit kind of spots where you could begin to get started with Evergreen?
I think one of the easiest, and we kind of brought it up, which is like, what does our year look like, right? What do we want to be talking about and when, is a pretty easy place to start to understand whether or not you have, because it's a big question. We just went, we just covered this, but a big question is, do we have an amount of content that would allow us to run an Evergreen campaign? Because you do need to change the creative up, right? You do need to be talking about other things. And so understanding what those things are and more strategically kind of when you're going to be talking about them is a really good starting place to understand whether or not you've got the content and then what it would actually look like in terms of execution. Sorry, Eric, I think you were going to. say
No,
something?
no, I think that makes sense. I think in terms of like a place to get started is similar to what you were saying. It's take a look at what you've kind of got planned for the year ahead. What are the opportunities? What are the budgets you've set aside? And then think about how those can be allocated in more of an evergreen format. Even, it doesn't have to be a wholesale switch, overnight saying, oh, we only do evergreen, but you should start doing some of it, start putting some energy into evergreen. And then, over time, you can start to think about, okay, we've got a bit of a base running, and now we're going to use our evergreen campaign, campaign here, or the fact that we're evergreen to have campaign moments, right, within the same, because you can think about there, we sort of alluded to it, but there's the benefits both from the platforms, there's the benefits from the audience, and so if you can start to think about the fact that you're going to be marketing all year long. The whole year is one long marketing message, for lack of better words. Think about how those things connect, right? Because one of the things that can be most jarring from a user, from an audience perspective, is just the lack of disconnection between the thing that you were talking to me about a month ago and the thing that you're going to start talking to me about now. So think about, if you take the time to sort of put pencil to paper and just draw out, like, what is the plan over the course of the year? What do we need to talk about? And if you plan that out, you have then flexibility for things that come up, right? The world is going to change over the next 11 months between here and the end of the year. And as it changes, as things evolve, if you've kind of built that base messaging, for what you're going to be covering over the course of the year, it's going to be way easier for you to see opportunities to say, hey, this thing's happened. How do we bring that in? Well, you create creative that connects the dots between what you've been talking about and what you need to talk about, and you take it to the same audience. As opposed to saying, oh, we have to go and start completely from scratch and find an audience and get them to care, from starting up. So, I think just starting to think about how you put your toes in that, putting that pencil to paper, having that meeting with, between marketing and fundraising, and finding out, what are people's objectives over the course of the year. Good places to start.
I think humans really like some level of expectations about what's coming next, right? Like, we like to be delighted at times, right? Like, I love a quirky meme out of nowhere as much as the next person. Like, that can make my whole day, right? When something comes out that way. But I think there is some base level of, consistent brand, what to expect. I do want to see impact. I do want to hear about people's missions somewhere dotted in among the asks. That educational piece, I think, is something that nonprofits who are doing educational repurposing and content repurposing when it comes to Evergreen, I think they're just a little bit of a step above, and I think their donors and the people who are on the journey with them are just a little bit more engaged because there's some consistency there, right? And there's some education piece, and even if it's new education, like, oh, hey, we've got this cool new program, we want to tell you about it. That's still somewhat evergreen because it falls under a greater brand development plan, right? Like, yes, it's new, but it's not necessarily new in a way that is shocking to your viewers or your audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
I think Chris has a great point here, thinking about, like, how do you have stuff to talk about, right? You have your mission, you have your vision statement, you've got probably these strategic plans. What does it look like to spread that out over the course of the year, right?
Yeah.
So just to say, like, if our goal is to get someone to care about us by the end of the year, what does that through line look like? What touch points? What should they know about us by the time it comes, for us to really be hitting fundraising season, for lack of better words, right? So you can think about that, and certainly there's great opportunities within a lot of the stuff that we already have as organizations. Whether that's existing campaign windows that we could think about how they thread in, or just to our core, the mission, the vision, the things that we're actually just trying to achieve at the very high level, because that's the thing that's going to bring someone closer to the organization. Is they're going to have to connect with that. It's going to have to resonate, and that's who you want. You want someone where that they're going to resonate with your mission and with the vision that you have for your impact.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole other one of these that could be done on value propositions and vision statement. I think
Mhm.
one of the things that we find most valuable is really sitting down. If you haven't, as a group, looked at your unique value proposition in a while, and this is something you're interested in, especially on the new donor side, sitting down and making sure that it is as clear and concise as possible is a really valuable exercise, something that I think a lot of organizations aren't consistently looking at because it evolves over time. Things change, organizations change, and really making sure that value proposition is well understood across everybody in the organization and across obviously the communications that you're putting out, is something that really should be a kind of initial step in really any content planning, and really Evergreen in particular. I mean, one of the exercises that we like to do with clients is to bring their value proposition to people who have never heard of the organization and ask those people, like, what do you understand this organization to do? And more often than not, the answers we get from these people are quite confused, right? They generally think they have something to do with the nonprofit sector, but specifically what it is they're looking to accomplish is a bit of a question mark. So yeah, Chris, there's a whole other hours that we could do on articulating your mission, vision statement, your value proposition.
So there is one question that has come in, and we're getting into the final minutes here. So I'm going to pull it in quick. Either Eric or Trevor is going to hit this. But do you have any recommendations, tips for creating evergreen content management systems? And I know, Trevor, you've got a few tools that you use in place. Any recommendations, guys?
I mean, it doesn't have. So you go ahead, Trevor.
It doesn't have to be paid, is what I was going to say. Yeah. I think that's what you were going to say. We've had clients bring us Excel documents before.
Yeah.
Like simple stuff like days of the month, months, and simply kind of lay out the individual content. Mm-hmm. If you're looking for paid services, certainly things like Hootsuite, there's Buffer, there's a ton of kind of paid programs that allow you to schedule some of this content. Truthfully, I think an offline calendar that different departments have the ability to feed into and update is probably your best way forward, at least kind of to get started. And then when things get a little bit more unwieldy, you can look at a paid service. But yeah, Eric, I don't know if you feel any differently.
No, I was going to say that pretty much the same thing. I think not overcomplicating it too much too early with tool sets, but just, pencil, paper, spreadsheet, like just get the through line down and then start to see, okay, where do we need to be, right? Because I think if you think about what your evergreen strategy is, like what's your content over the course of the year, well, then you have to start thinking about who is the target audience for this content. Where are they, right? Like, are they on LinkedIn? Are they Pinterest people? Are they TikTok? Like, where are they? Or maybe they're a little bit of everything, and maybe you don't know, and you have to kind of try a little bit of everything to figure out where they are. But you're gonna use that as your kind of starting point, and then services like Trevor was mentioning. There's another one. Feather could be a really great opportunity. Both email and paid media together. So there's different tools that you can be using to kind of run it, but honestly, it's not necessarily something that requires paid tools out the gate. It just requires a little bit of time and energy and thought about what this is going to look like and kind of how you're going to spread this out over the course of the year and measure. What are you going to try to measure? And that'll be a big thing to talk about in one of our future ones as well, right?
So I'm just going to throw up our email address here and thank you guys for joining me and doing this, because this was super fun and it felt like a conversation we were consistently having internally, and a shame that no one else got to hear it. And thanks to Chris, who put in some amazing comments. We should have had you on this panel discussion.
Next time, Chris.
Next time, Chris. But also, we are going to be following up. This is part 1 of a 3-part series. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be back with Trevor and our lovely other panelist, CJ. And we're going to be talking about email, and kind of like that next step. Here was part 1, just kind of laying the groundwork on Evergreen. And then we're going to be coming back with a big discussion of email and Evergreen. And then part 3 is going to be talking about ads. And so we're just going to kind of roll this Evergreen train along. So thank you all for joining. Was amazing. And just a little last Hootsuite and Sprout Social. There you go. And nonprofit discounts for some of these programs definitely exist. TechSoup often has some great discounts on there too. So please get in touch, and I'll be following up with some resources afterwards. And thank you everyone who joined us today.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Tasha.
I guess.